just
You
wait
good.
until they hit go. Is it time?
You good.
Okay, all right. All right, well, thank you so much for having me. Special thanks to Tomas. I'm so delighted to be here in New Mexico, especially out of the Pennsylvania long winter. I didn't know what kind of introduction I was going to get, so I thought I'd give you a little bit of my own introduction. I won't go over it all again, but like Tomas said, I teach at Lafayette College, which is one of the 8 million liberal arts colleges in the mid-Atlantic states of New England. That's a picture of it when it's not covered in snow. Here's a cover of my first book, the one that just came out with NYU Press, called Border Medicine, and as he said, it's about Mexican-American folk healing, a history of that over time, and especially about the impact that that folk healing has had on various ethnic communities, including Anglos, throughout its 150-year history. All right, but let's get to today. I wanted to give you a little heads up about what I'm going to do during this time period. I don't think it should take me, I know we have an hour. I certainly won't talk for that entire time. There'll be time for questions and answers. If I had been talking about my first book, I think I'd be able to walk around and talk off the cuff because I've been studying and working on that for about a decade. What I'm going to tell you about now is from a new project, a new book I'm writing about the history of the Santuario de Chimayo, from before it was built up to the present times. I've just started writing it this year. I'm on sabbatical right now and working on it every day. So I feel a little less comfortable with the topic. So I am, God bless you, I am going to read a little bit from some of the things I've been writing. But I promise to read as animatedly and excitedly as possible so you don't dip off to sleep. It's a pretty interesting topic, at least from my point of view. So I will give you a little context overall, and then we'll get to the sale itself in 1929. And I assume, and maybe this is not fair, in Pennsylvania, a lot of people have never even heard of the Santuario, but I assume most of you have heard of the Santuario, and many of you have probably visited there. Am I correct in that assumption? I hear a lot of nodding. Okay, great. Excellent. And I was going to make up something about how I was going to actually talk about the rise and fall of the Third Reich. April Fool's Day, but there you go. Okay. All right. The legend about the origin of the Santuario that many of you may already be familiar with is that a man named Bernardo Abeta, who was an hermano mayor of the local penitente order. The penitente is the famous folk order of Catholicism in northern New Mexico. Was out praying in the field, or he was sick on his porch looking at his field, or he was with his brothers from the penitente order in his field. But in all of these, what happens is he sees a light in the ground, and he goes and digs in the ground, and he finds this incredible crucifix. And he thinks, oh, this is wonderful. He takes the crucifix from where he lives in Potrero, which is one of the villages that kind of comprises the overall village of Chimayo. He takes it 8 miles down the road to Santa Cruz, puts it in the parish church there on the altar, thinks, okay, I've done my duty, I found this beautiful thing. Well, it disappears. The crucifix goes back to the hole in the ground. All right? He tries that again. He brings it with all the people now. They're all excited. They bring it down the road to Santa Cruz, 8 miles. They come back, and the crucifix comes back to the hole in the ground. He thinks, you know what? I'm getting the impression here that God wants me to keep the crucifix here. This crucifix doesn't want to move. So that is the legendary provenance, at least, of the Santuario de Chimayo. And they start building. He starts building in 1813. The building finishes building in 1816. And if you've been there, the Pocito, the hole in the ground in the side chapel where the people get the dirt, is supposedly, at least, the hole itself where the crucifix was found, giving it its miraculous power to heal. It's important for later in our story, but also throughout the 19th century, that Chimayo is 8 miles from Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz then, and not now, but then for many, many years, was the parish under which Chimayo was placed. It was a mission of Santa Cruz, and it rarely received the ministrations of an actual ordained priest. Because of this distance, 8 miles is not that far, but it turns out that Santa Cruz had many of these little missions to deal with. And so the Chimayo de Santuario was a place that for most of the 19th century had occasional but not frequent visitations from an actual clergy person. It remained well within local control for most of the century. Now, as you probably are aware, the pilgrimage is coming up later this week, but that got started even before the construction was finished, and possibly before the construction began, pilgrimage to the site of the holy dirt in Chimayo where this crucifix was found. And the crucifix that hangs on the main altar now, there's debate about whether it's this or a smaller crucifix in the room of the Pocito. But here he is, the Señor de Esquipulas, which is named after a Guatemalan crucifix, which is a whole other story. Here's the hole in the ground, the Pocito, where people gather just tons and tons of dirt every year. And just in case you do think it replenishes itself miraculously, they're very open about this. They have dirt and they dump it in continuously throughout the day. Otherwise, it would be down to Australia by now, or somewhere, I don't know where. And here is a picture I found of the pilgrimage. The pilgrimage mostly happens on Friday. Some activities will definitely get underway on Thursday. And they can expect from what I've heard, between 20 and 40,000 people later this week in the area of Santuario. And the people are going there both to pray with the crucifix, with Santo Niño de Atocha, who's not really part of our story today, and to get dirt out of the hole. Now, throughout the 19th century, and before I get to today's topic, the 1929 sale, I will say that Bernardo Abeyta was the owner of this chapel, of the Santuario, for his entire life. He like many chapels throughout the state, throughout the Spanish Empire for that matter, they were owned privately, but they were approved for Mass and other sacramental functions by the Catholic authorities. And that was the case here too. When he died, he left the chapel, the Santuario, to his daughter, who had married a fellow named Chavez. So it was in the Abeyta Chavez family until 1929. And as I said, beginning in 1813, there is documentation from the diocese in Durango in Mexico, which was the diocese that covered this area until U.S. annexation, that there was approval for the Santuario to be used as a Catholic church. Now that started to break down some after U.S. annexation. Here's our buddy Archbishop Lamy. As you may know, he was the first Archbishop of the new diocese of Santa Fe, which continues to be the Archdiocese today. And when he was French, and his idea of control of the local churches was different in many ways from the Spanish Catholic authorities beforehand. You may know some of this story already. But he, generally speaking, wanted more control and more clerical oversight of these kinds of places. And there is debate at this point during the time of Abeyta's daughter, Carmen Chavez. A fellow named Father Francolon, who was the parish priest in Santa Cruz, was encouraged by Lamy to get the family to give the Santuario to the church. And depending on which historian you read, some people say, well, that was well within his rights. He was a faithful servant of the church, and he was trying to, solidify the Archdiocese's care of its churches. Or you can read other historians, one who says that Francolon was, quote, a youthful autocrat who was very proud of his own authority and basically de facto excommunicated the Chavezes after they refused to give him the Santuario. In any case, there was tension in the end of the 19th century over who would own it. All right. So, now, like I said, God bless you. I am going to read quite a bit, but I'll do my best. By the time New Mexico became the 47th state in 1912, the Santuario was nearing its centennial. The transition from territorial status to statehood had little effect on Chimayo, and the church remained a locally and regionally important place of pilgrimage for Hispanos within the expanding nation. However, changes were on the horizon as more and more people from the eastern part of the country made their way west, some of them settling permanently in the Rio Arriba region. And if you know, Rio Arriba is the area north of Santa Fe and north. Rio Abajo is down towards Albuquerque and farther south. Historical memory of the Santuario at this point in its history begins to take a turn for the romantic, as Anglo observers came to depict the place as one of timeless innocence and spirituality. In this sense, descriptions of the simple devotion of the people of Chimayo serve as a microcosm of a more general Anglo attitude concerning the Hispanic population and the Hispano aesthetic in northern New Mexico. For instance, Bradford Prince, who was both the governor of New Mexico and the president of both the Historical Society of New Mexico and the Society for the Preservation of Spanish Antiquities, intoned in 1915, "The people of Chimayo are contented to live almost entirely on the products of their own valley. Money is little needed where requirements for happiness are so few, and the community illustrates the philosophy of content, which proclaims that happiness is not attained by the multiplication of possessions, but by the satisfaction of a few real wants of man, and the absence of desire for anything that is unattained." Northern New Mexico villages, Mexican villages like Taos, Abiquiu, and Chimayo at this time period, due to a growing tourist industry, began to be valued for their picturesque qualities. Tourists and automobiles learned about destination points from travel brochures produced by new businesses catering to these visitors. A 1929 Santa Fe Transportation Bulletin recommended a stop at Chimayo to observe the Santuario. The information provided demonstrates that the shrine was not merely of architectural interest, but also exposed the tourist to the exotic cultural practices of a credulous and perhaps magical people and their healing dirt. I'm going to read to you a paragraph from this travel brochure, and I do want to thank Thomas again because I found the brochure upstairs. The usual method, this is quoting the brochure, "The usual method employed to obtain the benefit desired was to take a small amount of the earth and make of it a sort of tea or drink. Those who came from a distance usually took back with them a small quantity of the earth as a safeguard against possible illness in the future. If an invalid were too ill to be brought to the Santuario, earth was taken to him. However one may account for these strange results, it cannot be doubted that there are possibly hundreds who attribute their health and healing to the miraculous power of the Santuario." Now, the brochure does not advertise healing for the Anglo visitors, the Anglo tourists, but rather the opportunity to gaze upon a people who are being healed by the holy dirt, a manufactured experience of imagined simplicity and immediate faith. And since the Santuario remained at this time in the private hands of the Abeta and Chavez families, visitors in the earliest decades of the century could visit without the imposition of official Catholic interpretations of the healing miracles that went on there. Indeed, the relationship of the Chimayosos, which is to say the people from Chimayo, with the Santuario in the early 20th century remained in key ways outside the control of the Catholic Church, meaning that the rituals and healing miracles that persisted in the chapel stayed distinctly connected to Hispano village life. To be sure, priests could be called upon for baptisms, marriages, and deaths, but they had to travel from Santa Cruz. The majority of the time, the Santuario and the other local chapels in Chimayo served as gathering places for the faithful for prayer and festival celebrations. Now, due to this ongoing dearth of official Catholic oversight, Chimayo in the first decades of the 20th century continued to be a place where the penitentes carried out both their solemn rites and their pastoral mission to local families in grief or in need. Holy Week featured various penitente rites and processions through Chimayo and the surrounding communities. Residents who were children in the early years of the century later remembered impressions of late-night chanting and praying, bleeding torsos from self-flagellation, and particular ritual reenactments. These included Good Friday observances of the Stations of the Cross, community singing of hymns, alabados, and solemn meat-free meals. Now, despite the religious vitality of Chimayo, national and international forces well beyond the bounds of northern New Mexico were inevitably affecting the rhythms of life there. The arrival of the railroad in Española in 1880 had already ushered in a new era of outside access to the region's natural resources. Hispanos in the rural economies of the villages were attracted to wage-earning jobs in new extractive industries as well as on the railroad itself. As men and women left the villages, often seasonally for outside labor, the patterns of land usage and mutual support changed. Historian Suzanne Forrest suggests that these economic changes resulted in at least two important cultural changes for these Hispanic villages. First, the semi-communal use of land for agriculture was disrupted when an individual, his productivity or her productivity and earnings began to outweigh prior mutual goals centered on livestock and crops. If, for example, a young man was working away on the railroads or in lumber during the planting season, his reliance on his wages was matched by his lack of involvement in village agricultural production. Second, the transfer to a money-based system left Hispano villagers more open than ever before to the fluctuation of national capitalist markets. Now, while this meant economic success for some, for most Hispanos, they remained tied to menial and low-paying jobs, even as the mutual support of village life became less and less reliable. The Santuario, still in private hands, likewise found itself tied to these inevitable economic changes. So on the eve of the Great Depression, the Chavez family's stewardship of the Santuario suggests that the family, like many others in the region, had fallen into dire circumstances. The Santuario and its sculpture and artwork had always been valuable to pilgrims and devotees for prayer, healing, celebration, and contemplation. But in the changing economic environment, the Chavezes found themselves in what must have been the excruciating position of having to sell items associated with the church. A front-page story in the Santa Fe New Mexican from February 9, 1929, reports that the family had already sold 3 bultos, bultos are the wooden statues, to the Spanish and Indian Trading Company, and that other dealers and art collectors in Santa Fe had been offered the Santuario's famous carved wooden doors. Others were reporting that the entire church was for sale. Unconcerned with the plight of the family, the newspaper pleads in the article, and I quote, "Is the Lords of America, the world-famed chapel of Santuario of Chimayo, painted by a score of artists, declared by many the most beautiful thing in New Mexico, to be dismantled, its sacred relics peddled to curio dealers, and the ancient place of miracles to be used for some commercial purpose?" Well, the short answer to this sensational question was no, but as we shall see, this absolutely was a turning point in the history of the Santuario. All right, Mary Austin, the writer of over 35 books and numerous other plays and essays, had settled in Santa Fe in 1924 after a peripatetic and eruditely adventurous life. She found Santa Fe and New Mexico in general a fit place to be her land of journeys ending. In this, she was certainly not alone among the literati of the era. Several other artists, writers, and cultural mavens settled in a colony of sorts on the famed El Camino del Monte Sol here in Santa Fe. Artist Frank Applegate was her nearby neighbor and frequent collaborator. Others in the general area included Alice Corbin Hendrickson, Gustav Bowman, and John Gaumin. Farther afield, Georgia O'Keeffe, Mabel Dodge Lujan, and occasionally D.H. Lawrence were part of her coterie. Along with Lujan's house in Taos, Austin's home on El Camino, La Casa Carrilla, served as a frequent salon and guest quarters for members of this new Anglo-cultural elite. Austin loved New Mexico for all of the normal reasons: its incredible topography, its climate, and its seeming otherness within the United States. But she also loved it for what she referred to often as the Indian blood of the people, both in the native people and in the admixture she discerned in the Hispanic villager. In these people, she found a project of curation and restoration that would guide her in her new home. She declared, quote, "What I felt in New Mexico was the possibility of the reinstatement of the handcraft culture and of the folk drama," end quote. Frank Applegate had long been collecting santos, handcrafted furniture, and punched tin, and Austin soon joined him, gathering Hispanic folk literature, drama, and songs. Before Austin's arrival in New Mexico in 24, an earlier group had organized themselves in 1913 into the Society for the Preservation of Spanish Antiquities in New Mexico. But it was under Austin's and Applegate's leadership that this group was transformed and eventually settled in the name of the Spanish Colonial Art Society. The 1929 Certificate of Incorporation for the Society defines its work not only in terms of preservation, but also in revival and supervision. The mission of the members was, quote, "to acquire, preserve, and protect places, property, both real and personal, things and articles relating to or exemplifying or representing Spanish colonial art, and to provide for the custody thereof, to restore places, things, buildings, and property, both real and personal, relating to or exemplifying Spanish colonial art. In response to what it considered to be the destruction of traditional New Mexico village life and culture, the society focused itself on acquisition and custodianship. For Austin, Applegate, and the other members, it was only through the society's proper oversight and vision that the handiwork, folk life, and aesthetic integrity of New Mexico's Hispano past would be rebuilt, maintained, and ideally sealed in time, like an ancient creature caught in amber. Austin understood the society thus to be ultimately responsible for what she described as the rebuilding of that shattered culture. Well, another key figure in the revival of the so-called Spanish colonial arts was the architect John Meme. Meme was one of the foremost exponents of the Spanish Pueblo style, marked by adobe construction, flat roofs, exposed beams, and other features reminiscent of both Pueblo and Spanish mission buildings. And I understand that he designed the room we're in.
Yeah.
Oh. So, feel it, soak it up. Following in the footsteps of other architects who had pioneered this style around the Southwest in the first decades of the 20th century, Meme left an indelible mark on New Mexico cities. However, one of his initial interests and inspirations were New Mexico's various village churches, including the Santuario de Chimayo. Early in the 1920s, he served as the supervising architect for a group dedicated to these places called the Committee for the Preservation and Restoration of New Mexico Mission Churches. No doubt, Meme's expertise and aesthetic vision made him an ideal candidate to join with Austin and Applegate in the Spanish Colonial Art Society. So after the official incorporation of that group in October of 1929, the Society's first action was to purchase a retablo, which is sort of a wooden altar screen, from the Llano Quemado chapel south of Taos, but the plight of the Santuario soon piqued their interest. The artist Gustav Bowman had also sent word that a bulto of Santiago, astride his horse, had already been sold and that other pieces were on the block. His intelligence on the situation was passed along to E. Dana Johnson, the editor of the Santa Fe New Mexican, at which point that paper published news of the impending sale of the chapel's artworks and architectural features, the story I showed you previously. It's not surprising that Johnson would make this front-page news. While he himself was not a member of the Colonial Art Society, like many in his social circle, he was committed to maintaining the aesthetic and cultural distinctives of the state. In Johnson's obituary, Alice Corbin Hendrickson writes of him, quote, "He supported every cause and movement that tended to keep New Mexico and Santa Fe, its ancient capital, a symbol of the races that made it, to preserve its essential character and integrity," end quote. Now, the unsigned cover story about the Santuario, which was likely by Johnson himself, lists several cultural preservation organizations that had already voiced interest at that time in raising funds for the Santuario's purchase, including Meme's Church Preservation Group, the New Mexico Historical Society, and of course the Spanish Colonial Art Society. Conspicuously absent from this list of potential buyers of the Santuario is the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. In fact, the article cites Santa Fe's Father Bernard, who confirms that, quote, "There was nothing in the rumor that it was desired to build a Catholic chapel on the site. He said it had not been used for Catholic services for many years." So when the story breaks that they're going to sell the chapel, the Santuario, Mary Austin was lecturing at Yale, a vantage point which allowed her to move quickly to raise the $6,000, that's all it costs, it's a lot of money then, necessary to purchase the Santuario outright from the beleaguered Chavez family. The great majority of historical sources about this sale describe her donor as anonymous, although Austin did identify the person as Catholic and elsewhere said to be a Yale graduate. The poet and New Mexico transplant Winfield Townley Scott at one time claimed that the donor was Olivia Murray Cutting, the mother of New Mexico's Senator Bronson Cutting. And the latter, Bronson, was a trustee on the board of the Spanish Colonial Art Society, which suggests he may have facilitated a gift from his mother, but the donor's identity is likely and ultimately unknowable. The actual transfer of the funds to the Chavez family came together as a piece of newsworthy theater. At some point in the time prior to the Santuario sale, the Archbishop of Santa Fe, Albert T. Dager, who we see seated here, had been made the chair of the Spanish Colonial Art Society. And so it was from his hand that the money officially was exchanged during a staged ceremony of transfer. Other society members included Neem, he's the guy holding the papers, Austin, she's the lady with the white hat, Applegate, he's in the background there on the right, Alice Corbin Hendrickson and Gustav Bowman, I'm not sure what they look like. The newspaper editor Johnson and others were also present there as witnesses. This fellow here might be Jose Chavez, the family member. I'm not sure about that either. The deed of property, importantly, did not go to the Spanish Colonial Art Society, but was turned over immediately to the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. The article that covered the story of the sale in the Santa Fe New Mexican reports that a delegation from Chimayo, headed by Jose Chavez, was on hand, but no other mention is made of the locals, and only Meme is quoted in the article. And Meme says, one more beautiful and historic thing associated with Santa Fe has been preserved. Now, Meme went on to say that church services would be restored in the building as soon as possible. And for me, at least, his comments suggest that Meme and others from the society had achieved their goals. First, the picturesque history and aspect of the place, the Santuario as viewed by Santa Fe Anglos, had been maintained intact. And second, the scope of Santa Fe's artistic and touristic circle had unquestionably somehow been expanded to 30 miles north to encompass the Santuario as a sort of extension of the aesthetic ideals of Canyon Road and El Camino del Monte Sol. Even the reinstatement of Catholic Masses, or the promised reinstatement of Catholic Masses in the Santuario for the Santa Fe observers, was less about restoring the pious function of the place and more about retaining the folk drama of village rituals. It's remarkable to what extent Austin's and Applegate's romantic preservationist goals were met in Chimayo. It's worth quoting at length from a letter that Frank Applegate sent to Mary Austin, dated February 20, 1929, fully 8 months before the sale was finalized. Applegate writes to Austin, "Just at present, the Santuario seems to be safe. The people of Chimayo have gotten together and will not allow the old man who claims he owns it to sell. Also, they came down to Santa Fe together and took back the bultos, including Santiago, and the large chest back to the Santuario today. Of course, it is unsafe as long as it is in native hands. They are likely at any time to go on a restoring rampage and ruin it, as they almost did when they put on wooden towers and tin roof a few years ago. Of course, it should be one of the churches of the natives. It will always be, as long as they control it. I suppose it should be under the control of the Archbishop, with a guarantee that it should never be altered, and whenever it is repaired, not to make changes." Of course, the most telling phrase in this letter is Applegate's confidence that the Chimayo natives will be unable to care adequately for the Santuario. He is quite explicit in his fears. The Chimayosos will adulterate the place by making updates and changes to the building that might detract from the Spanish colonial aesthetic valued by Applegate and his cohort. The calculation to place the chapel under the Archdiocese's control indicates that the nascent Spanish Colonial Art Society, of which Archbishop Dager was a prominent member, considered the Catholic Church to be a safer custodian of the place than the people of Chimayo. Nonetheless, one can yet sense Applegate's reluctance to turn over full control to the church. Both the newspaper and Mary Austin's private communications reveal that some sort of agreement had been forged with the Archdiocese that no changes would be made to the structure of the building without the express approval and oversight of the Spanish Colonial Art Society, most likely under the supervision of the architect John Galmin. Now, it's not altogether clear from the documents that exist what role Archbishop Dager played in these events, other than the fact that the Spanish Colonial Art Society gave him the $6,000 that was used to buy the Santuario from the Chavez family. In fact, Austin's own feelings about the role of the Archdiocese in New Mexico are complicated and sometimes pretty critical. An episode from the salon that was her home illustrates this point. The famous novelist Willa Cather wrote a good deal of her famous novel Death Comes for the Archbishop while she was staying in a guest bedroom in Austin's house. And after Austin read the novel, this is what she had to say about it. When it was finished, I was very much distressed to find that she, Cather, had given her allegiance to the French blood of the Archbishop. She had sympathized with his desire to build a French cathedral in a Spanish town. It was a calamity to the local culture. We have never gotten over it. It dropped the local mystery plays almost out of use and many other far-derived Spanish customs. It was the rebuilding of that shattered culture that the Society for the Revival of the Spanish Arts was concerned. I know you all wake up every morning and feel the pain of that French cathedral in this town. So Austin thus links the Archdiocese of Santa Fe and its French roots under Archbishop Lamy with the very genesis of the Spanish Colonial Art Society. So that an agreement could be made with Dager suggests that this Archbishop, given his leadership in the society, he must have shared at least some of the preservationist goals, if not the entire vision of Hispanic village life that Applegate and Austin so value. So if this agreement between the Catholic Church and the Spanish Colonial Art Society did indeed exist, it may have been only in verbal form, as no written trace of it persists to the present day. To be sure, absolutely no mention of the Society's oversight and control of renovations is made in the legal documents of the Santuario's sale. Some significant changes to the exterior of the Santuario had already been made, presumably by the Chavez family, in the early 1920s prior to the sale. The flat earthen roof over the nave of the chapel was covered with a metal gable, a common solution to roof leaks in older adobe architecture. And at the same time as this renovation, the flat roof bell towers on the facade were also topped with metal gables, and the openings for the bells were framed in wood. After the purchase, a metal roof was likewise added to the adjoining sacristy and the room containing the pocito with the holy dirt. So before turning to my analysis of this momentous transaction from the Abeta family to the Archdiocese, I want to read to you one short postscript about the sale. And it has to do with a descendant of Bernardo Abeta. In a 2004 feature story in the Santa Fe New Mexican about the history of the Santuario, a reporter interviewed Bernardo Abeta's great-great-grandson, a guy named Raymond Chavez, who was then 57 years old, about his and his family's memory of the transaction between Austin, Applegate, and the Archdiocese. When Raymond Chavez was informed at this point of the 1929 sale, he responded, "I don't believe it." And he added that he had never heard the story before. In fact, according to his own grandfather, Francisco Chavez, the family traded the Santuario for cattle. Quote, $6,000 was a lot of money back then, and if the Chavezes would have kept that money, that would have made them better off than I knew them to be. End quote. In other words, descendants of the family do indeed remember the transfer of the Santuario to be based on economic necessity, but the role of the Anglo artists and writers in Santa Fe in the affair had not, at least in 2004, become part of Chavez family lore. All right, the sale of the Santuario to the Catholic Church in 1929 marks a turning point, not only for the Santuario, but also the changing fortunes of northern New Mexico and its Hispanic villages. As the economic livelihood of places like Chimayo shifted from semi-communal agricultural ventures to wage labor, mostly outside the bounds of the village, other changes also took hold in the way religious life was regulated. These changes had everything to do with the slow but inexorable incorporation of New Mexico into the social imagination and sense of nationhood of the United States. For white culture brokers like Mary Austin and her artsy confreres, New Mexico represented a spiritual tie to the indigenous and Hispano past of the Southwest and a source of artistic inspiration in the starkness of its landscapes. But it also represented an aesthetic project writ large. Preservationist organizations like the Spanish Colonial Art Society and John Gaumin's Village Church Preservation League, worked like an enormous piece of installation art in which whites, smitten with their own romantic renderings of New Mexico, could build and maintain picturesque tableaus throughout the state. In many ways, the purchase of the Santuario allowed these new residents to freeze an image of New Mexican religious life. The miraculous dirt was just the kind of detail that made the Santuario such an appetizing piece of vernacular architecture, not to mention the priceless recados lining the walls and the fine folk drama of penitential pilgrimages. However, part of this whole process remained insistently racial. The Hispano villager was best appreciated by the outside Anglo artist when he was understood as the more or less pure descendant of either the spiritual and mystical Indian or the dramatic and chivalrous Spaniard. When these outside appreciators recognized racial mixing at all among the Hispanos, it was often an almost biologically determined explanation of Hispanics' discrete artistic and ethnic heritage. For instance, in her autobiography, on the page directly before her account of the purchase of the Santuario, Mary Austin writes, quote, "The colonists who first came here originally came direct from Spain. They had not much tarrying in Mexico. They brought with them what they remembered, and as soon as they began to create, they made things in the likeness of the things of old Spain, modified by what they found here among the Indians. They accepted the Indian house, but added a fireplace. They brought chests, but added tables and chairs in the Spanish pattern. They made santos and bultos in the pattern of the holy images of 16th century Spain. They mixed with the Indians, the peon class, and brought into their blood an Indian strain, Indian capacity for making things, for design and color. It takes more than 100 years to destroy patterns in the blood." End quote. Clearly, it was important to Austin that Hispano New Mexico represented overlap, if not melding, of the Spanish and of the Native American. Her engagement with Hispanics as mostly Spanish with some Indian thrown in for spice and color, of course, was not unique, but rather part of her overall aesthetic branding, of the overall aesthetic branding that was taking place at this time all around the Southwest and California. As historian Suzanne Forrest, who I quoted previously, points out, quote, "While Indians had appealed to American romantics from the beginning, there was a problem with Mexicans, who had been almost universally despised as dirty, backward, ignorant, and lazy. To romanticize Mexican culture, it had to be cleaned up and relabeled as Spanish." End quote. It's thus not insignificant that Austin's and Applegate's preservationist group was called the Spanish Colonial Art Society. Now, at first blush, it might seem strange that this society would turn ownership over to the Archdiocese, especially under the influence of Mary Austin, who had proven herself critical of the Franco-American Catholic Church in New Mexico. But this decision should be understood as one more calculated move in the aesthetic project of Hispanic village preservation. In short, the villagers were to be appreciated for their simplicity, their mystical and dramatic spirituality, and the air of Spanish romance and medieval atavism that surrounded them. But they were ultimately not to be trusted with maintaining themselves in patterns that the Santa Fe artists found acceptable. At the time of the sale, it seems that Archbishop Dager, as a member of the Spanish Colonial Art Society himself, was a trusted partner in this endeavor, although one wonders if he was more interested in ecclesiastical control of the chapel than in promoting the Hispanic pageantry and miraculous healing that perhaps appealed more to his other colleagues in the society. To be sure, if Anglo tastemakers of Santa Fe wished to remain in control of in perpetuity of the Santuario, then they made a mistake by entrusting ownership to the Archbishop. But what of the Chimayosos and the other faithful Hispano pilgrims to the Santuario? What about them? Well, at least for 30 years after the chapel left control of the Chavez family, not much changed for the local people in terms of use and access to the church. The Santuario, now officially owned by the Catholic Church, seems to have remained a mission of the Santa Cruz de la Cañada parish, though records of this relationship in the official Catholic directory maintained by the Archdiocese are spotty, through the first decades of the 20th century. After 1931, the Santuario no longer appears in those records as an official mission of Santa Cruz, but this is likely an absence in the documentary record rather than a reflection of actual fact. But as they had done for more than a century, the people of Chimayo relied on visiting clergy to celebrate Mass and receive the sacraments. Their other religious needs remained met by household devotions and the ongoing ministrations of the penitente order. The Archdiocese's inability to act quickly to restore the crumbling Santuario and to initiate regular Masses in the church indicate an important disconnect between the original preservationist aspirations of the Spanish Colonial Art Society and the administrative realities of a poor and spread-thin Catholic Church. To be sure, pilgrimage and miraculous healing continued to take place at the Santuario after its sale, but this had little to do with the efforts of the Anglo artists and elites from Santa Fe who so desired to stage Chimayo as an ongoing piece of primitive theater. Nor can the ongoing centrality of the Santuario as a place of Hispano devotion be attributed to Archbishop Dager or his immediate successors, who were also not able to either stifle these devotions or to change the daily rhythms of the Santuario for the next 3 decades of the 20th century. In this sense, the 1929 sale of the Santuario remained a legal fact, but a practical fiction. Despite the continuing local control of the chapel, its dirt, and its role in annual festivals and pilgrimages, the English language press in Santa Fe found several opportunities in the following years to recast the sale of the Santuario as its saving grace. A 1961 feature story in a tourism-focused magazine went so far as to claim that the Hispano-Catholics of the region had longed for its sale. Quote, "The villagers of Chimayo saw their fondest wish granted when Archbishop Albert T. Dager accepted the little chapel on behalf of the Catholic Church." End quote. As dissonant as this statement is with the reality of long family ownership of the Santuario, it nonetheless gives a fair picture of the success that the Spanish Colonial Art Society achieved in terms of forming Anglo understanding of what Hispano villagers wanted and needed for the maintenance of their own religious practices. In this understanding, of course, the villagers wanted the church to own their Santuario, to validate as well as to oversee their faith. This notion played directly to mid-century tourists who looked to the Hispano villages to have their assumptions confirmed about the simple piety and Catholic allegiance of the ancient people of the land. Thank you. And I really do thank you for hanging in there through the long reading. I wish I was more dynamic for this. Yes, sir.
I've heard some speculation about the Santuario and how it came to be. Many antibiotics are found in the soil and had a high concentration of something like terramycin.
Is that right?
And that it was first used by Native Americans who realized that it did have some kind of healing power. I know that I come from an old house family, and people used to swear by it. My grandmother's and my great-grandmother's generation, that it really worked, and it was probably a very, very valuable commodity.
I don't know if you heard what the gentleman said, but he said that there have been some studies that there might even be antibacterial properties to the soil there, and that the Pueblos knew about it. I can certainly confirm that it's very, very likely that, and it's part of Pueblo mythology, that there's mud and springs in the area that have healing dirt properties. And there's every reason to believe that the finding of the crucifix is sort of a Catholicization or a baptism of Indian traditions about the healing nature of the dirt itself. Yeah. And now, do you come from a Hispano family in house? Or?
Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, it's not limited to Hispano families, though. It's been used by lots of different New Mexicans for a long time. Yes, sir.
The graveyard that's in front of the Santuario, was that transferred with the sale?
Yes, it was. The sale documents mark off to the yard what are in the actual property. The Archdiocese owns almost all of the property now, but at the time they owned that area too. And those graves are still there, of course, the ones that are right in this little courtyard.
Yeah, we have a friend from France, and we took him and his wife up there,
Uh-huh.
he looked and he said, that's a French tombstone.
Yeah, there you go. Right.
Because he said, that's like at home.
Well, and at the time, you know, after about 1870, the vast majority of clergy in New Mexico were French. There were a few local guys who had got ordained under Padre Martinez and his seminary in Taos, but they were way outnumbered by French clergy that Lamy and his successors imported.
I never knew that. Did you?
I'm still at sea about the transfer. You mentioned documents.
Uh-huh.
Do the documents identify the buyer and the seller?
Yes, they identify the archdiocese as the buyer and the seller as Jose and Dolores Chavez.
And do they specify that $6,000
They do,
was
yes.
the transfer?
Yes.
So how do you account for the family having no awareness of $6,000 having been transferred?
Well, I think it must have been a hard memory to want to take on, and I think it would have been maybe something they would have liked to forget. Not only feeling like this was our family heirloom that we had to sell, but it was also sold to the archdiocese, with whom local people had a difficult relationship at times during that period, especially. And also any idea too that new coming sort of Anglo trendsetters and cultural makers would have been associated with that, I think would have been a difficult thing to incorporate as memory. It does show how malleable memory is.
Oh, yeah.
The law firm is involved. Now that's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. There is a deed of sale, and I assume there might have. It's a legal document, and you can get it. I don't know. Good question.
Are you aware of the proposed Disneyland type of development that's planned up there by the diocese?
Yes.
And my question is, how does the current Colonial Arts Society feel about that?
I don't know how this. By the way, I feel like I knocked the Spanish Colonial Arts Society throughout this whole thing, and I know we have someone, at least one person, who does great work there. It's a wonderful resource in New Mexico now, and I don't think they're going around trying to orchestrate Hispanic life throughout New Mexico anymore. But just with that
Do they
said,
support that?
I don't know if they do or not. There is a local town group in Chimayo that is vehemently opposed to some of the updates, changes. As an historian, I don't want to get involved in that, but I can say as an historian, the more things change, the more they stay the same. The Santuario turns out again to be a flashpoint where differing ideas of what devotional life, what aesthetic norms for that place should be, what sort of religious practice should take place there, who may go there, who may who can own it, not only physically, legally own it, but who owns it sort of in a religious sense, like this is my church, this is my right as a tourist. So, sir.
As you approach the Santuario toward its entry, if you look to the left, there's another chapel of some kind.
The Santo Niño Chapel.
Yes, is that a family chapel or
Yes.
Okay.
It was built in the 1850s by the Medina family as sort of a competitor to the Santuario right across the road. And it was owned by the Medina family until very recently. The Archdiocese bought it, I want to say in the 90s, though I don't quote me on that, much more recently. And they've renovated it completely. It was in disrepair as well. And they currently now, it's still the Santo Niño Chapel, and it's dedicated to veneration of the Santo Niño de Atocha and his care for children. But they've also made it a very colorful, what some people have called the Disneylandification of the place. Other people really like it. It's very child-centric now. A lot of colorful art. It's supposed to make children feel comfortable. But yes, it was a family chapel, and indeed the Medinas are buried right in front of it, and you can see their tombs, their graves, just as you can see people in front of the Abeta Santuario. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to commend you on your pronunciation Association.
Thank you.
And everything in your discussion. How did you become interested in this particular subject?
Okay, well, my dissertation and then later my book was this exploration of Mexican folk healing. And how I got into that is a long story, but as a younger person, I lived in Argentina for a couple of years. And then when I wanted to study, I knew I wanted to study, get a PhD in religious studies, I wanted to study Mexican saints. And the more I learned about saints, the more I realized that everything about saints is about healing, pretty much. You know, they're venerated because they're powerful healers, physical healers, and also social healers. And so I got really interested in folk and religious healing, and that led me to that first project. I also am a graduate. This is not in my CV, I don't think, but I'm a graduate of the United World College in Las Vegas. I was and I learned to love New Mexico in those 2 years. Do you know about this place? Yes. It's fun. You know? So I'm not a total stranger to New Mexico. I'm no native, but I did. Hey, that's the first time I fell in love was there. It's got to count for something, right? Okay. So there I was, and I've always loved New Mexico. And now that I'm getting to choose my own research projects as a grown-up academic, I figured I should choose one that lets me go to New Mexico all the time. There's also no full-length book about the history of the Santuario, which is, I think, something that needs to be remedied, and I'm working on it.
What do your students back east think about this unusual little place in New Mexico?
You know, it's so outside of their purview. Almost all of my students are Catholics, but they're mostly Italian or Irish Catholics. You know, Easton, our school, you can see New Jersey from the campus, so it's basically like very Catholic. And you know, they understand folk devotions and folk saints, and Grandma having special practices that she does. But this is just so a world apart from them.
Do you know the Ball family who own the Potrero trading post?
Yes,
next door?
Raymond has been a very helpful conversation partner. And he's active in the village group that is not so happy with the changes going on at the Santuario. And he also sells really good chili. So,
I was interested in your before and after pictures of the Santuario. And certainly, it's hard to imagine John Gaudin designing the little gables.
yeah, you know, and they actually got put on fairly late, but a lot of people think they were put on to sort of also make it look Frencher. Is Frencher a word? Frencher.
It is.
Yes.
It is. More French.
Yeah, to meet the aesthetic desires of the priests in the area would be like, okay, let's make this look more like a church that we would recognize.
I'm not so sure about that. I heard stories that it was just being very hard to maintain. And John Gaudin, was actually saved. They said it was a pretty bad.
Yeah,
pretty bad shape.
absolutely. I think that's very reasonable, and I certainly wouldn't take a position at this point in my research. But this definitely has made it possible for the church not to disintegrate. I can also say that this 3-decade window, 1929-1959, the church continued to deteriorate at that time period. Finally, the fathers of the Holy Family, who are currently in charge of the place, came. And if you met Father Roca, yeah, he's a legend, right?
Yes.
He's going to be 97 in July, I understand. He's about this tall. In the early 60s, the entire backside of the Santuario was about to fall off and fall into the Santa Cruz River. And he got local people to donate time and just tons of dirt and shored up the entire thing. And he single-handedly, looked over sort of the caretaking and restoration. I don't want to say single-handedly, that's not fair, with also the support of the community. But he was very much instrumental in keeping it a going and vital church community.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
One more question there?
When we lived here in the 70s and we went to the Santuario all of the times, there were crutches
Yeah.
They're still there.
Are they still there?
Yeah.
I missed them last year.
Yeah, they're still
Well,
there.
that's not quite true, because they have redone that chapel to take those baby shoes and a lot of those crutches over to Atocha.
Yeah,
There are a few crutches,
Yeah,
but not like,
yeah.
I was here to say.
there are probably, I would say, 30, 40 crutches in the Santuario itself, but there are a lot more in other buildings.
Okay.
If you haven't been there lately, it's worth going just to see. In the last 3 years, there have been major changes to the area, which will be sort of once, I know you all are just going to buy my book and you're going to love it. Give it a couple of years and it's done. That'll be in the last chapter, some of those ongoing things. But as a historian, I'm trying to take the long view. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Was the Spanish Colonial Art Society involved in all the landscaping around there that's been done recently, all those changes?
No, they
Just
have.
the diocese?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but no. In fact, the Spanish Colonial Art Society, from what I understand, has been. They're aware of this fact that originally in the documents, or at least in the tradition, they were to oversee renovations. But since it's not in the legal documents, they really have been, and the Archdiocese is absolutely the owner of the place. It really hasn't been up to their review.
I make one last
Okay,
comment.
one last, you betcha.
It's being said right now that the Santuario is getting more money than they know what to do with.
Oh yeah, really? I didn't know that. I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, there's a lot of people there. I'll admit I'm somewhat sympathetic to the current Catholic administrators because 100,000 people visit that place every year. And some infrastructure has to be put in place for that to be done safely. But,
Yeah.
I've been to the sanctuary at Medjugorje in Croatia, and there's restaurants, there's buildings all over because they get so many people.
yeah.
And it's just sort of the safety of it.
It's certainly a boon economically to the local people, that's for sure. Well, I just want to say to you again, thank you so very, very much for having me. I've been looking forward to this for months, and I appreciate it.